In the dusty plains of Central Asia, the year was 1979, and the air carried the faint scent of impending change. Amir, a young Uzbek soldier with a wiry frame and eyes that held both curiosity and caution, sat cross-legged on the rough wooden floor of the barracks in Tashkent. The room buzzed with the low hum of conversation among his comrades, a diverse group of men from the southern Soviet republics, Uzbeks, Tajiks, Turkmen, and Kazakhs, united under a single banner. They were part of the newly formed 154th Separate Spetsnaz detachment, a unit that would soon earn the nickname Muslim Battalion due to its unique composition. The Soviet military had crafted this elite force with a deliberate purpose: to leverage the soldiers' linguistic skills, cultural familiarity, and Islamic heritage to blend into the Afghan landscape as the Kremlin prepared to intervene in a brewing conflict south of the border. Amir's journey to this moment had been unconventional. Born in a small village near Samarkand, he had grown up listening to the call to prayer echoing from the local mosque, a sound that intertwined with the laughter of children playing in the dusty streets. His father, a cotton farmer, had instilled in him a sense of duty to family and community, while his mother taught him the verses of the Quran, her voice soft yet firm. When the Soviet draft notice arrived, Amir saw it as an opportunity to escape the monotony of rural life and prove his worth. His fluency in Persian, a skill honed through trade with Afghan merchants, and his physical agility caught the eye of recruiters. Before he knew it, he was whisked away to a grueling training camp, where he learned the art of silent infiltration, hand-to-hand combat, and the cold precision of marksmanship. The barracks that day were alive with a nervous energy. The Soviet leadership had been watching Afghanistan with growing concern as the communist government of Nur Muhammad Taraki struggled to suppress a rising tide of Islamist insurgency. Taraki's land reforms and secular policies had alienated the rural population, and the Mujahideen, fighters fueled by faith and tribal loyalty, were gaining ground. The Kremlin saw an opportunity to secure its southern flank, and the Muslim Battalion was to be the vanguard of this covert operation. Amir overheard snippets of conversation about the mission. They were to be deployed as a fraternal force, their faces and tongues a disguise to mask the Soviet hand. The irony was not lost on him. Men of faith sent to uphold an atheist regime's agenda. General Vasily Kolesnik, a broad-shouldered man with a face carved from granite, entered the barracks that evening. His presence silenced the room instantly. Clad in a crisp uniform adorned with medals, he carried an air of authority that demanded respect. "You are the bridge between two worlds," he began, his voice resonating off the bare walls. "Your faces, your language, your faith, use them to secure Afghanistan for the revolution. This is not just a military operation, it is a political one. You will be our eyes and ears, our swords and shields." His words were met with a mix of pride and unease among the soldiers. Amir felt a swell of patriotism. He had been chosen for something greater, but the weight of his dual identity tugged at his conscience. How could he reconcile his Muslim upbringing with the Soviet cause? The training intensified in the weeks that followed. The battalion was drilled in the art of deception, learning to mimic Afghan dialects and customs. They practiced night marches through the arid steppes, their boots kicking up clouds of dust that clung to their sweat-soaked uniforms. Amir excelled in these exercises, his quick thinking and agility earning him the trust of his superiors. He formed bonds with his comrades. Rashid, a lanky Tajik with a sharp tongue and a knack for storytelling, and Omar, a burly Turkmen whose strength was matched only by his gentle demeanor. Together, they navigated the physical and emotional rigors of preparation, their laughter a brief respite from the looming uncertainty. The call to action came on a frigid night in December. Under the cover of darkness, the battalion was airlifted to Bagram Airfield, the Soviet Union's foothold in Afghanistan. The roar of the helicopter blades drowned out Amir's thoughts as he gripped his AK-74, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth of his breath. Landing on the tarmac, he was struck by the stark beauty of the Afghan landscape. Jagged mountains silhouetted against a starlit sky, a land both alien and familiar. The unit was quickly ushered into a briefing room where Colonel Boris Karimbaev, a seasoned officer with a reputation for leading from the front, outlined their mission. They were to protect Taraki, whose government teetered on the brink of collapse, and to root out Mujahideen cells threatening Soviet interests. Amir's first patrol was a baptism by fire. Clad in uniforms hastily dyed to resemble Afghan attire, olive drab shirts and striped undershirts that mirrored local styles, he and his squad moved through the outskirts of Kabul. The city was a labyrinth of mud brick houses and narrow alleys, its streets alive with the chatter of merchants and the occasional cry of a muezzin. The soldiers' presence drew curious glances, some hostile, others indifferent. Amir felt the weight of those stares, a reminder of the delicate balance they were tasked to maintain. As they rounded a corner, a sudden burst of gunfire shattered the calm. His heart raced as he dropped to a crouch, returning fire alongside. Rashid and Omar. The skirmish was brief, but it left 2 Mujahideen fighters dead and a lingering tension in the air. The days that followed were a blur of patrols and ambushes. The battalion's ability to blend in proved effective, allowing them to gather intelligence on Mujahideen movements. Yet the local population grew wary. Whispers of Soviet aggression spread, and the soldiers' Muslim identity became a double-edged sword, trusted by some, suspected by others. Amir found himself grappling with these dynamics. During a rare moment of rest, he sat with his squad against a stone wall, their laughter echoing as they shared stories of home. The photograph captured that fleeting peace, Amir in the front row, his arm around Omar, while Rashid leaned against him, their faces etched with exhaustion and camaraderie. The political landscape shifted abruptly with Taraki's overthrow by Hafizullah Amin in September 1979. The battalion's mission evolved overnight. Amin, though a fellow communist, was seen as unreliable by Moscow, and the Kremlin ordered his removal. Operation Storm 333 was set in motion, a daring plan to storm the Tajbeg Palace and install a more compliant leader. Amir, now a squad leader after proving his mettle in earlier engagements, was thrust into the heart of the operation. The night of the assault was etched in his memory. The cold bite of the wind, the clatter of boots on the palace grounds, the flash of gunfire illuminating the night. As they breached the palace walls, Amir led his men with a mix of fear and determination. The image of a soldier mid-leap, reminiscent of the photograph, came to life as Ivan, a Russian officer attached to their unit, vaulted over a barricade to tackle an Afghan guard. The chaos was unrelenting. Bullets ricocheted off stone, shouts filled the air, and the scent of gunpowder mingled with the dust. Amir's squad fought their way to the upper floors, where Amin's guards made their last stand. The operation succeeded, but the cost was high. As dawn broke, Amir surveyed the scene. Bodies strewn across the marble floors, the Soviet flag raised over the palace, and the weight of their actions settling in. The aftermath brought a new reality. The battalion was no longer a covert unit. They were now frontline warriors in a war that would define a generation. Amir's squad was redeployed to the northern provinces, where the Mujahideen held sway. The landscape was unforgiving, rugged mountains and dry riverbeds that tested their endurance. Each mission brought them closer to the enemy, yet farther from the ideals they had been promised. The photograph, taken during that brief respite in Kabul, became a talisman for Amir, a reminder of the unity and hope that had once bound them. As the war loomed larger, he knew their journey was only beginning, a path fraught with sacrifice and the search for meaning in a conflict that blurred the lines between faith and duty. In the quiet moments, Amir reflected on the words of General Kolesnik. They were indeed a bridge, but one stretched thin over a chasm of conflicting loyalties. The call to duty had brought him to this land, but it was the bonds with his comrades and the echoes of his heritage that would guide him through the storm ahead. The Muslim Battalion, forged in the crucible of war, stood at the threshold of a decade-long struggle, their story unfolding against the backdrop of a nation in turmoil. The assault on Tajbeg Palace lingered in Amir's mind like a fever dream. The echoes of gunfire and the acrid smell of smoke etched into his senses. The night had been a whirlwind of chaos, bullets whizzing past, the thud of boots on marble, floors, and the guttural shouts of men locked in combat. As his squad advanced through the labyrinthine corridors, Amir's heart pounded with a mix of adrenaline and dread. The image of Ivan, the Russian officer, leaping over a barricade with the grace of a predator, mid-air in a tackle that brought down an Afghan guard, burned itself into his memory, a snapshot of bravery amid the carnage. By the time the palace fell and Hafizullah Amin lay dead, the Muslim battalion had proven its worth, but the victory was bittersweet. 14 of Amir's brothers-in-arms were lost, their bodies carried out under the pale dawn light, their blood seeping into the Afghan soil as a grim testament to the cost of their mission. The aftermath brought a shift in their role. No longer a covert unit tasked with deception, the battalion was thrust into the forefront of the Soviet-Afghan War, a conflict that would stretch across a decade and leave scars on both sides. Stationed in the northern provinces near Kunduz, Amir and his comrades faced a landscape as unforgiving as the war itself. Jagged mountains that loomed like silent sentinels, dry riverbeds that cracked under the sun, and villages nestled in valleys where danger lurked in every shadow. Their days were a relentless cycle of raids on Mujahideen strongholds, ambushes in the high passes, and inspections of caravans suspected of smuggling weapons from Pakistan. The weight of their rifles grew heavier with each mission, their uniforms stained with dust and sweat, their spirits tested by the endless horizon of conflict. The local population, initially confused by the sight of Muslim faces in Soviet uniforms, began to turn hostile as the war's toll mounted. Amir remembered the first time they entered a village near Baglan, a cluster of mud brick homes with children peering from doorways, their eyes wide with curiosity. The elders greeted them cautiously, offering tea as a gesture of hospitality, unsure whether these soldiers were liberators or invaders. But as Soviet airstrikes leveled nearby hamlets and the Mujahideen's propaganda painted the battalion as traitors to Islam, that hospitality curdled into resentment. Stones were thrown during patrols, and whispered curses followed them like a shadow. Amir felt the sting of this rejection deeply. It was as if his heritage, once a bridge, had become a chasm separating him from the people he was meant to understand. The battalion's reputation grew, fueled by their tenacity and the strategic advantage of their cultural familiarity. They conducted operations with a precision that earned them the grudging respect of their Soviet commanders, but the casualties mounted with each engagement. In a particularly brutal ambush in the Panjshir Valley in 1982, Amir's squad was caught in a crossfire as Mujahideen fighters descended from the cliffs above. The air was thick with the crack of rifles and the whistle of RPGs, and Amir watched in horror as Omar, his Turkmen comrade, took a bullet to the chest. The big man's fall was silent, his strength extinguished in an instant, and Amir's cries were lost in the din as he dragged Omar's body to safety. That night, under a sky streaked with smoke, Amir sat with Rashid, the two of them silent except for the occasional sob, the weight of their losses pressing down like the mountains around them. Back in the Soviet Union, the war's human cost began to stir unrest. Riots broke out in Almaty in 1986, sparked by the return of zinc coffins, the sealed metal caskets carrying the bodies of fallen soldiers. Families demanded answers, and the Muslim Battalion, though celebrated for its valor, became a symbol of the regime's entanglement in a distant quagmire. Amir received letters from home, his mother's handwriting trembling as she described the protests and the growing fear among the villagers. The disconnect between the battlefield and the homeland gnawed at him, fueling a quiet rebellion within. He began to question the Soviet narrative of liberation, the propaganda that painted the Mujahideen as mere bandits. Were they not also Muslims, fighting for their beliefs as he had once been taught to value his own. This internal struggle crystallized during a rare ceasefire in the Panjshir Valley. Amir's unit was tasked with securing a temporary truce to allow humanitarian aid to reach a besieged village. It was there, amid the rubble and the wails of the wounded, that he met Ahmad Shah Massoud, the legendary Mujahideen commander known as the Lion of Panjshir. The meeting was unplanned. Amir had been sent to negotiate a safe passage for a medical convoy when Massoud emerged from a tent, his presence commanding yet serene. Over a cup of green tea the two men spoke, their conversation a delicate dance of suspicion and understanding. Massoud's words were measured, his eyes piercing as he spoke of jihad, of a struggle not just against the Soviets but for the soul of Afghanistan. "You are one of us," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Why do you fight for those who deny your God?" Amir was shaken. The encounter stirred memories of his childhood, of the mosque where he had prayed, of the stories his grandfather told of resistance against foreign rule. He returned to his unit with a turmoil he could not voice, his faith and duty clashing like storm clouds on the horizon. Colonel Boris Karimbayev, a man who had led the battalion through its darkest hours, noticed the change in Amir's demeanor. The colonel, a gruff but perceptive leader, pulled him aside one evening as they watched the sun dip behind the mountains. "War tests us all," Karimbayev said, his voice low. "You carry a burden I cannot lift, but I see your heart. Keep it close." The words offered no resolution, only a tacit acknowledgement of the moral maze they navigated. The war pressed on, its rhythm dictated by the seasons and the ebb of Soviet resolve. In 1984, the battalion was deployed to support a major offensive in the Kunar province, a region notorious for its Mujahideen strongholds. The operation was a grueling affair, with Amir's squad scaling cliffs under enemy fire, their breath visible in the frigid air. The photograph of a soldier mid-air, captured during a training exercise, seemed to mirror the desperation of those moments, men leaping over obstacles, defying gravity and death. The offensive succeeded in pushing back the Mujahideen, but the victory was Pyrrhic, the landscape littered with the wreckage of helicopters and the bodies of both friend and foe. As the years wore on, the Soviet leadership grew weary. The war, once framed as a noble cause, was increasingly seen as a drain on resources and morale. By 1988, with the Geneva Accords signaling a withdrawal, the battalion's role shifted to a rearguard action, protecting convoys and securing supply lines as the Red Army prepared to leave. Amir, now a seasoned veteran, led his men with a quiet resolve, his face lined with the wear of battle. The losses had thinned their ranks. Rashid had been wounded in a mine explosion, losing an arm, and Ivan had fallen during a skirmish in Ida, 1987. His leap over that barricade years ago now a distant memory. The camaraderie that had once sustained them was fraying, replaced by a stoic acceptance of their fate. The withdrawal began in February 1989, a slow and somber retreat under the watchful eyes of the Mujahideen. Amir stood atop a BMP-1 armored vehicle, the mountains of Afghanistan receding into the haze as the convoy rumbled toward the Soviet border. The Muslim Battalion had left an indelible mark. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers from Central Asia had served, with estimates suggesting nearly 100,000 from Uzbekistan alone had fought or died. The air was thick with the dust of their departure, the silence broken only by the creak of tracks and the occasional crackle of a radio. Amir's thoughts drifted to the men he had lost, their faces flashing before him like ghosts. Omar's gentle smile, Ivan's fearless leap, Rashid's laughter. The war had changed him irrevocably. The faith that had once been a source of strength now felt like a wound, its purity tainted by the blood he had shed. The Soviet cause, once a beacon of duty, had revealed itself as a mirage, leaving him adrift in a sea of conflicting loyalties. As the convoy crossed into Soviet territory, Amir clutched the photograph of his unit, taken during that brief respite in Kabul, a moment of unity before the storm. The image, with its soldiers in striped undershirts and weary smiles, was a relic of a time when hope still flickered. The war's end brought no closure, only a lingering question. What had they fought for, and what had they become? In the months that followed, as the Soviet Union itself began to unravel, Amir carried the weight of those years. The Muslim Battalion's story was one of sacrifice, of men caught between worlds, their bravery overshadowed by the futility of their mission. The photograph, tucked into his jacket, became a silent witness to their struggle, a legacy etched in the sands of a land that would never forget them. As he stepped onto Uzbek soil, the call to prayer rang out, a sound that once brought comfort, but now stirred a complex ache. The war was over, but for Amir, the battle within had only just begun. As the Soviet withdrawal began in February 1989, Amir stood amidst the retreating convoy, the mountains of Afghanistan fading into the distance like a mirage dissolving under the harsh midday sun. The rumble of armored vehicles and the clatter of tracks filled the air, a stark contrast to the silence that had settled over the war-torn land. Dust swirled around him, coating his uniform and stinging his eyes, as the Muslim Battalion made its final exit from a conflict that had defined a decade of their lives. The landscape, with its rugged peaks and scarred valleys, seemed to watch them go, a silent witness to the hundreds of thousands of Uzbek, Tajik, and Turkmen soldiers who had fought there. Veteran estimates suggesting nearly 100,000 from Uzbekistan alone had served or perished. The weight of that legacy pressed down on Amir, a burden compounded by the faces of lost friends. Omar's gentle strength, Rashid's resilient spirit, and Ivan's fearless leap over a barricade, a moment frozen in time that still haunted his dreams. The cries of Afghan children caught in the crossfire echoed in his memory, their innocent eyes a stark reminder of the war's indiscriminate toll. The journey back to Soviet territory was a somber affair. The convoy moved slowly, its pace dictated by the need to avoid ambushes from the Mujahideen, who shadowed their retreat with a mix of triumph and caution. Amir stood atop a BMP-1, his hands gripping the cold metal, his gaze fixed on the receding horizon. The air was thick with the scent of diesel and dust, the silence among the soldiers broken only by the occasional crackle of a radio or the cough of a comrade. He clutched the photograph of his unit, taken during that fleeting respite in Kabul, a moment when they had laughed in striped undershirts, their faces unmarred by the war's brutality, unaware of the storm that would soon engulf them. The image was a talisman, a tether to the camaraderie that had sustained him, now frayed by loss and disillusionment. Upon returning to Uzbekistan, Amir faced a new battle, one of reintegration into a society that no longer recognized him. The Soviet Union, in its final throes, hailed the Muslim Battalion as heroes, their courage celebrated in state propaganda and military parades. Medals were pinned to his chest, and official commendations praised his leadership, but the accolades felt hollow. The Muslim community, once the bedrock of his identity, turned its back on him. In the villages near Samarkand, where the call to prayer had once been a comforting rhythm, he was met with cold stares and whispered accusations. To them he was a traitor, a tool of an atheist regime that had waged war on their faith. His mother's tearful embrace offered little solace. Her eyes reflected the shame of a community that saw his service as a stain. The disconnect was palpable, a chasm that widened with each passing day. Amir sought refuge in isolation, retreating to a small room above his family's crumbling home. The walls, once adorned with family photos, now bore the weight of his scribbled notes and half-finished letters. Writing became his salvation, a way to process the chaos of the past decade. He documented the battalion's story with a raw honesty, its bravery in the face of overwhelming odds, the betrayal of a cause that had promised liberation but delivered destruction, and the forgotten heroes whose names were lost to the sands of Afghanistan. His pen traced the outlines of battles, the faces of comrades, and the moral dilemmas that had torn at his soul. The photograph, pinned above his desk, served as a muse, its soldiers frozen in a moment of unity that contrasted sharply with the fractured reality he now inhabited. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 added another layer of complexity to Amir's struggle. The state that had sent him to war dissolved into chaos, leaving veterans like him adrift. Pensions were delayed, promises unfulfilled, and the glory of the Muslim Battalion faded into obscurity. Amir joined other veterans in Tashkent, where they gathered in cramped apartments to share stories and mourn their losses. The gatherings were bittersweet, filled with laughter over old jokes and tears for those who hadn't returned. Rashid, now a one-armed mechanic, was a regular, his resilience a quiet inspiration. Together, they pieced together a narrative that the official history had ignored: the human cost, the cultural dissonance, and the lingering question of why they had fought. As the years passed, Amir's writings grew into a manuscript, a testament to the battalion's duality. He described the pride of being chosen, the thrill of early missions, and the gradual erosion of that pride as the war's futility became clear. He wrote of Ahmad Shah Massoud's words in the Panjshir Valley, which had planted seeds of doubt, and of Colonel Karimbayev's silent understanding, a bond forged in shared hardship. The manuscript was a labor of love and pain, each page a cathartic release. He sent copies to veteran groups and local newspapers, hoping to spark a dialogue, but the response was muted. Afghanistan was a distant memory for a nation focused on its own rebirth, and the Muslim Battalion remained a footnote. The turning point came in 1996, when a young journalist from Tashkent, Amina, sought Amir out. Her father had served in the battalion and died in 1988, and she was researching a story on Central Asia's forgotten wars. Her curiosity rekindled Amir's resolve. They spent hours in his room, poring over his writings and the photograph, her questions breathing new life into his memories. Amina's article, published in a small independent paper, garnered attention beyond Uzbekistan, reaching diaspora communities and international scholars. The photograph, reproduced with the article, became a symbol of the battalion's complex legacy: soldiers laughing in the face of doom, their striped undershirts a thread connecting them to the Afghan people they had both fought and resembled. The attention brought mixed blessings. Some hailed Amir as a voice for the veterans, inviting him to speak at gatherings in Almaty and Bishkek. Others accused him of glorifying a war they wanted buried. In Afghanistan, the photograph circulated among Mujahideen veterans, sparking debates about the Muslim soldiers who had served the Soviets. Amir received letters, some hostile, others conciliatory, each adding to the tapestry of his story. In 1999, on a quiet afternoon, he visited the graves of his comrades in a Tashkent cemetery, the headstones weathered but bearing names he could still recite by heart. The call to prayer drifted from a nearby mosque, its familiarity now tinged with melancholy. He placed the photograph on Omar's grave, a silent tribute to the man who had been his anchor. The new millennium brought a shift. As Afghanistan descended into Taliban rule and later the U.S. invasion, Amir's manuscript found a broader audience. Translated into English and Russian, it was studied by historians and featured in documentaries about the Soviet-Afghan War. The Muslim Battalion emerged from the shadows, its story woven into the larger narrative of Cold War proxy conflicts. Amir, now in his 50s, became a reluctant figurehead, traveling to conferences where he spoke of the war's human cost. The photograph, now digitized and shared online, inspired art installations and poetry, its soldiers immortalized as symbols of resilience and tragedy. Yet, the personal toll remained. Amir's marriage, strained by his absences and the war's lingering shadows, ended in divorce. His children, grown and distant, struggled to understand the father who carried Afghanistan. In his soul, he found solace in a small garden behind his home, where he tended roses, a nod to the beauty he had once known. The manuscript, now a published book titled Echoes of the Sands, became his legacy, its pages a bridge between his past and the world that had moved on. In 2005, he received an invitation to a veterans reunion in Moscow, where he met former comrades and even a Mujahideen fighter turned peace activist. Their handshake, captured in a new photograph, symbolized a fragile reconciliation. By 2025, as the world marked the 40th anniversary of the Soviet invasion, Amir's story had reached a new generation. At 63, he lived a quiet life, his health waning but his spirit unbroken. The Muslim Battalion was no longer forgotten, its bravery and betrayal debated in classrooms and online forums. The original photograph, framed and displayed in a Tashkent museum, drew visitors who marveled at the soldiers' duality, Muslim men in Soviet service laughing amid chaos. On a crisp September afternoon, with the clock ticking toward 3:18 p.m. PKT, Amir sat in his garden, the call to prayer a distant hum. He held the photograph, its edges worn from years of handling, and smiled faintly. The war had taken much, but it had also given him a voice that, through his writings, would endure long after the mountains of Afghanistan faded from his sight.